So for this week's video, we're looking at the football crazy scenario. Two friends are going to come with me to go to a football game to watch the Cowboys play the Vikings in Dallas, Texas. So for friend one, they're the inquisitive type. They're interested in the flying aspects, but um, don't really know a ton. We'll refer to them as Jake. And friend two, nervous about flying, we'll refer to as Sean, has a lot of questions and really just wants to make sure that we're going to be okay on this flight. So Sean asks first, you're not going to fly this plane all by yourself, are you? Well, I am going to fly this plane by myself, and one of the big ways that we're going to accomplish that is by fully utilizing SRM, or Single Pilot Resource Management. We hit on this in last week's video quite a bit, but the big thing about SRM is utilizing all your resources, especially before you ever get in the airplane. A lot of this goes into the aeronautical decision making, so you're looking at doing your own personal checklist. You know, how do you rate this flight? I would say that we don't really have a bunch of context on how experienced of a pilot I am, but we'll say that I'm fairly experienced and with the airplane as well. So this isn't a very risky flight, except for the fact that you're bringing friends along who can be a distraction, especially if you have a nervous a passenger. So just making sure that they're as comfortable as possible. You know, you don't want to freak them out. Um, and just not letting your friends become a distraction for yourself. Using the previous models as discussed, such as the Decide model, the PAVE checklist, and also using the I'm Safe model to determine what is your fitness to be flying this flight. We will say that don't have any illnesses. I'm very recent in my flying. I have good experience with the aircraft itself. I'm prepared for the flight, both physically and mentally, and ready to do this. And still, before we get in the plane, big thing to explain about single pilot resource management, like I said before, is doing everything that you can before you ever get off the ground. So we're going to do a very thorough flight plan from Minneapolis to Dallas. We're going to assume that there will probably be at least one, if not more than one, fuel stops. I'd probably guess at least two. Also, it's a long distance to travel, so considering any weather that's going to be going on during the distance of the flight, any holdups that there could be in Dallas, being that it's a football game. I know as an air traffic controller that when there are events going on, that can increase the amount of traffic going into that specific airport. In this case, Dallas is already a pretty busy airport, but you could see some added volume due to the game that's going to occur in that city. Making a good flight plan, making sure that you're prepared as far as if you do need to stop, if weather's going to be an issue, where can you stop? When I flight plan, I always like to plan for the worst case scenario. I like to flight plan so that I am never too far to where I couldn't, to put myself in a situation where I couldn't land the plane if I was, in this case, to have a dual engine failure and need to get on the ground fairly immediately. I also like to plan for, if there going to be any stops along the way, or if I have some kind of malfunction where I could get the airplane serviced, that we could end up, either continuing the flight or having it somewhere that the plane could get serviced on the airport itself. Also, utilizing my passengers. I'd explain to Sean, don't be afraid to, if you see something, say something. I'd say that to Jake as well. And you guys can help me out as far as in those phases of every phase of flight. If you see something, say something. You can give them little tasks. Obviously, I don't know if I would trust them with things such as making sure the doors are locked properly and like that. But after I lock it, maybe just making sure that that is the case, and making them feel like they're helping you out as best they can. I would also explain to them that, the busiest phases of flight, especially single pilot, are going to be the takeoff and landing, and probably more emphasis on the landing. So the less extra chatter there is, the less time I have to worry about the passengers, everybody getting set up, buckled in, giving them their pre-flight briefing in case something was to go wrong before the flight gets off the ground, and just limiting the distractions overall so that I can perform my duties as the single pilot. So next, Jake asks, so I flew with you in that single engine airplane once, or before. We're gonna assume that he did that before. So what's the difference between the single pilot fixed wing Cessna, or I'm sorry, single engine Cessna? We'll say it's a 172 fixed gear, and this multi-engine plane. Well, we'll start with the landing gear. Obviously, we're looking at we'll say we have retractable gear. So that is a difference because, before that's not really something that we consider. Now we got to consider landing gear as far as the amount of drag landing gear creates, especially in different situations, making sure that the gear is down before we land. That unfortunately happens all too often. You see planes land gear up with perfectly functional gear. Propeller differences. So, in a 172, you have basically a fixed propeller. You just change the speed of the propeller itself. Now we can change the pitch of the propeller blades themselves. We can change the speed. Obviously we're operating with two engines, so we're operating with two propellers. So that leads us into having two engines. Performance is improved in the fact that, if we're going on this trip, 3 people, we can carry luggage, and still have plenty of room left over between the 3 of us. We can even bring some stuff home with us and still have plenty of room. Go longer distances, travel faster in most cases, fly at a higher altitude if need be. And overall, just having the 2 engines just gives us that extra added sense of security that, if something does go wrong with one engine, that we do have the other one. There are many different differences in between as well. You'll see a lot more gauges. There's a lot more things to look at. There's a lot more levers. There's just, in general, a lot more going on than if you're looking at a fixed pitch propeller single engine airplane. A lot more moving parts, a lot more things for me to do as the pilot that are going to increase my workload compared to when you flew with me in a single engine plane. We'll say Cessna 172. Heating system's another great example of a difference. Typically you don't have carburetor heat because the engines are so much further on the wings. They're not directly in front of you as if in a 172. So we're looking at getting electric heat, which is something that could fail. We're talking doing a flight for a football game, so we're looking at fall to winter. Definitely going to want to make sure that that heating system is working and working properly, because if we're up at altitude flying in the winter, that heating system goes out, it's going to get really cold really quick, and that can be a very big risk factor in and of itself. We already talked about the more gauges. De-icing, you probably would see some kind of de-icing equipment for the wings, and carburetor icing. That's going to be an issue. That's going to be something in most piston engine aircraft, unless it's fuel injected. But carburetor heat operates essentially the same as before, just breaking up that carburetor ice are keeping it from accumulating at all. A lot of the other systems, pitot-static, it's going to be the same general system. The airframe obviously is going to be a little bit different. You're talking about a bigger plane, 6 to 8 seats. Two engines, going to be a bit wider. Propellers are going to be wider. That also leads to another consideration, which is safety around the airplane itself. If the engines are running, propellers are running, there's a lot bigger area of danger around that plane than there would be just in a typical single engine plane. In a lot of ways, a lot of the other things are going to be the same. When looking at twin engine, the big thing is going to be kind of the things we went over here. So Sean asked, well, what if something goes wrong? Will it be okay because they're two engines, right? So yes, I'll say yes. So we are flying from Minneapolis to Dallas. We're not going to be going over any mountainous terrain. We're basically even going across the the Great Plains down. No high altitude areas to speak of, to really avoid, or something that would be an issue if we were going to land and not having that single engine capability if we were to lose one at a high altitude, which this won't be an issue for this flight. If we do lose an engine, obviously there are things to consider. Depending on the plane, we're talking about a light twin here. There's no guarantee that we're going to be able to keep climbing if we're in a takeoff phase of flight, or depending on the plane, even maintain level flight. There are some things that we can do to make the performance as good as possible, such as limiting our drag, feathering the prop, making sure that flaps are up, the gear's up, lifting the dead engine, and making sure that we're as streamlined as possible to get whatever performance we can out of that single engine. But as far as, if that happens early on in the flight, probably not making it to Dallas. Carburetor icing, kind of talked about that before, but if we're keeping an eye on our carburetor heat and our carburetor temp, shouldn't be an issue. If for some reason it was to become an issue, making sure that we are using that carburetor heater, getting down to an altitude that we can prevent that carburetor from completely icing over. Cross-feed operations, you'd feel real dumb if you ran out of fuel and then to realize that you weren't cross-fed. So just making sure that you always understand where your fuel is coming from, and depending on what you have going on there. Backup systems in case of an engine failure. So this would be on me as the pilot, knowing, do I have backup systems? Do I, if I lose my left engine, what systems am I going to lose? Do I have, knowing myself, I'd probably get a plane that had those redundancies built in, because I don't want to be in a situation where I'm going to lose vital components of my aircraft just because I lose an engine. I want to be able to safely fly that as much as possible. Electrical failure, obviously it's an issue, especially you can lose radio communications with air traffic control. That can be an issue. But as far as electrical failure, the plane's not gonna follow the sky if we have an electrical failure. But we do have checklists we can go through, things to try to get around it. But electrical failure isn't catastrophic, but definitely makes completing the trip a lot more difficult. Landing gear failure, possible failure. I've seen this before, not in twin engine, but in single engine. We had put the gear down, and we were not getting all lights on, saying the gear was down. So we had to do a low pass by the tower, kind of turned ourselves a bit, and the tower was able to verify that our gear was down. Prior to that, we had done a bit of a slipstream maneuver where you try to maybe the gear partially came down, so you try to put yourself in a slipstream so that maybe it'll kind of force that gear to fall if it's not all the way down. Um, and if there was a situation where the gear does fail and it doesn't come down and we can't get it down, setting ourselves up in an approach profile and speed that will allow us to land on the belly of the aircraft safely, um, and just get another one. I mean, it's going to do damage to the airplane, but we'll live. No, Jake asked, don't worry, we can still land if something goes wrong. So this is true. We can land on one engine itself. There are things to consider, such as, how is the aircraft performing when you have all those things we talked previously about, close the cowl flaps, feather the prop, raise the dead, got obviously your dead foot, and your one, depending on which engine you lose, one of your feet's going to be really heavy on the rudder. Making sure that we're in that profile of getting as much as we can out of that aircraft on one engine. Let's say that we are going, we can do level flight. We're going for the approach. We don't want to drop any flaps or drop the landing gear until we absolutely know we're going to make it to that runway, because if you're low and you start dropping gear and other things like that and you just start falling out of the sky, well, you don't really got anywhere to go. So you need to make sure that you're able to make that runway. Obviously, landing with no power, this is where I like to plan. I always like to plan for the worst. I like to give myself a corridor when I fly from point to point, or whether it be a VOR, GPS, visual, whatever. Give myself a corridor where I know, okay, if I have an engine failure here, this place is in 5 miles and I can make that, or this place is in 3 miles, or I never want to be caught in a situation where you lose an engine and you're just in no man's land. I just don't feel like you should ever be necessary to put yourself in that situation. Yeah, maybe you'll go a little bit further out of your way than necessary, but you know what? I'd rather be safe than sorry. That's everything for this scenario, and hopefully Jake and Sean are ready for this flight and feeling good about it.